Welcome to People's Video Audio, a series of talks by author and political analyst Michael Parenti. His books include Democracy for the Few, Land of Idols, Political Mythology in America, and Against Empire. The topic of today's talk is Human Nature and Politics, a critique of conservative concepts of human nature. It was given in Los Angeles in May 1990. Here's Michael Parenti.
Well, you asked the question, what is human nature? The question is profoundly political, and one repeatedly hears that the human condition can't be altered in this direction or that direction because, well, that's human nature. I heard a college student, I didn't hear, I'm quoting from an article, I heard a college student after viewing a film on nuclear war, quote, "I don't see any way to end the arms race without fundamentally altering human nature." If that's so, there's no hope for us. Often it's the sinister side of human behavior that's treated as being emblematic of human nature and endowed with a certain grim inevitability. Wars, murders, rape, rapine, selfishness, plundering, greed, the lust for power and money, violence, all these have been ascribed to human nature. This tendency to blame human nature for existing social ills does have decidedly conservative implications, because if human nature is dominated by inescapably aggressive and acquisitive impulses, then the struggle for more cooperative, peaceful, communal relations seems to be foredoomed. But to reject this view of human nature and say that isn't true is also ideologically motivated. To reject it because it doesn't fit in with our presumptions about what we would like people to be and society to be doesn't make those postulations about human nature necessarily incorrect. They may be true. So what are we to do with this problem? It's a problem of political philosophy, but it's a problem that has very real and practical spin-offs. It's a very real and immediate problem. It's implicit in almost all political arguments and discussion. That's why I thought I'd talk about that instead of what a crap of Bush is and all that. You know all the other stuff already. Not to mention his son. Okay. Well, what do you do about this question of human nature and politics? My advice is that you proceed with extreme caution. You're recognizing that of human nature and politics we have no certain measure. First thing we do is we can cast doubt on present-day assertions that try to justify existing social relations as being grounded in human nature. One way you do that is by historical method. Namely, you point out that all social orders have resorted to that subterfuge. All of them have tried to justify the existing predominant social relations of their time as being anchored in human nature. Plato and Socrates, both of whom hated equality and democracy, who believed in the virtue of hierarchical order, both of whom hung around with aristocratic kids, a society in which everyone was in his or her place. The theme that comes up again in Plato's dialogues is Socrates saying the carpenter must be a carpenter and the shepherd must be a shepherd and the statesman is the statesman and the statesman can't be a carpenter and the carpenter can't be a statesman. The plebeians should not be voting in the assembly is another way of putting it. I mean, Socrates admired Sparta. And in Sparta, those ordinary democratic citizens who were voting in the assembly and participating in the assembly, in Sparta they were helots, they were slaves. And that was where they should be, really. That democracy, as they saw it, was unnatural. It was a corruption. And if you read the Republic closely, it's a kind of a nice fascist garrison state ruled by specially trained elites. And this was so because this was more in keeping with the nature of people. Well, Plato taught that people were born with different souls. I mean, he used it as a deliberate subterfuge, that we could tell people that there are those who are born with souls of gold, there are those who are born with souls of silver. The gold would be the philosopher kings, the silver would be the guardians, and then there's the artisans and the rest of the people, the ones who do what Veblen called the work of civilization, who really do what matters, which keeps everything going. They would be told they had, I forget what it was, souls of brass, wasn't it? Bronze. they would be, in effect, told that they're moral inferiors. You look at Aristotle. Aristotle came later, and Aristotle, de Saint Croix, I'm surprised, considers Aristotle a democratic thinker. Aristotle really, if you read him closely, he's really very uncomfortable with democracy. He kind of believes in kind of a middle, mixed, blended government. But Aristotle's another rich, privileged male in a patriarchal slave society. And he saw the status accorded to slaves and to women as an outgrowth of their respective natures. They had unfinished souls. Everywhere he looked, Aristotle found empirical confirmation for that belief. He looked at women, and they were consigned to domestic drudgery. They were deprived of opportunities for education, political citizenship, leadership, and participation. They were deprived of a chance to develop a whole host of skills, consigned to dependency and to a very limited role in society. So Aristotle looked at all these women and said, see, like every proponent of class, ethnic, and gender privilege before and since, he reversed cause and effect. Women's capacity was constricted by the limited roles to which she was assigned. And in fact, he turned that around, that the limited roles were taken as evidence of her deficient capacity. Aristotle was an apologist for slavery. In Book 1, Chapter 5 of Aristotle's Politics, quote, "Is there anyone intended by nature to be a slave?" He poses that question. Or rather, is not all slavery a violation of nature? Now, isn't that interesting, by the way, that he poses that? Because it was a source of controversy then. And you run into that conservative defense all the time, where people say, you're being anachronistic. You're suffering, you're committing the sin of modernity or contemporaneity. You are committing presentism, some historians say. You're imposing your values on that society. It's easy for you to condemn slavery, but slavery was the natural thing of their society. You sound a little bit like Aristotle, man. But in fact, in every slave society that's ever existed, there was a large component of people who were against that slavery. A fairly large component. They were known as slaves. And you ask any one of them if the master wasn't around, and they tell you. You read what the slaves said in the antebellum writings, the slave narratives in the American 19th century, and they will tell you how they hated it, how they detested it, how horrible it was. And even in that day, it was a source of controversy. There were people, and there were also non-slaves, who were arguing the case. I think Aristophanes was one. Talked about, and there were others who came out and said, let's abolish slavery. They were abolitionists. Otherwise, how would Aristotle even have had to feel compelled to raise the question, is there anyone intended by nature for slavery, or is all slavery a violation of nature? He obviously has had to confront that question because people were raising that question. Well, he goes on and he answers it. There is, quote, "There is no difficulty in answering this question on grounds both of reason and fact." So he's got reason and he's got fact. I love that quote by Benjamin Franklin that said, man is a rational animal because he's a creature of reason, and that he will always find a reason for whatever suits him and whatever he wants. So he has no difficulty, Aristotle, in answering this question on grounds of both reason and fact. From the hour of their birth, some are marked out for subjection, others for rule. There's your reason, there's your fact. Book 1, Chapter 13. As for women, quote, although there may be exceptions to the order of nature, a few weird ones, there's always that woman who they find out he was a she and she was general of an army or something. There's a few weirdos like that slip in. And there are always some men who may not want the male role, let's say. But Aristotle goes on, although there may be some exceptions to the order of nature, there may be, the male is by nature fitter to command than the female. The courage of a man is shown in commanding, of a woman in obeying. It's not exactly an equivocal statement here, is it? And before we dismiss such notions as hopelessly outmoded, recall the traditional marriage ceremony in vogue until recently, and by the way still used by many people, where a woman pledges to love, honor, and obey her husband. Oddly enough, today there's, by the way, a strain of radical separatist feminism, which doesn't speak for all feminism, but it does argue a biologically deterministic position, that women are free of the aggressiveness and power tripping that is inherent in male behavior, that women are the nurturers and purveyors of the finer, gentler virtues, opponents of patriarchal violence. Joanna Brenner has a nice criticism of that position, especially of Andrea Dworkin and Adrienne Rich. They argue male creativity lies in the appropriation of women's energy, subsequent spiritual annihilation. When Dworkin writes, quote, "Men love death," she's not speaking metaphorically. There's something about being a male that leads to the pursuit of death. These arguments, by the way, as Joanna Brenner points out, these arguments assume a feminine essence connected to women's childbearing capacities, and that because of that feminine essence, you get this biologically deterministic higher virtue than anything you could hope for in a male. By the way, to be sure, there is such a thing as male aggression. And male aggression against women is real, and it's of epidemic proportions, Holocaust proportions in this society, and it does have a biological base in that males are usually stronger. But it also has a social dimension in that they can get away with it. And they live in a culture that encourages such violent possessiveness and abuse of women and treats it as too often as normal or as a private family matter. That model, however, doesn't, I think, operate and doesn't explain history and doesn't explain the larger questions of politics that even people like Aristotle were trying to deal with. And I don't accept the idea of a female essence that's grounded in childbirthing, which is the source of male creativity, which men use to destroy women, etc. I mean, that's a little too heavy for this hour of the day anyway. Okay. Sometimes the privileged and powerful elements saw the nature of the natural order itself, not just human nature, but the whole entire natural order is called in to justify existing social relations. In many ancient societies in which property relations justified by totem myths and myths of creation, and these were used so that those with more property could justify their greater property holdings or their higher status or their privileged status. They would be the descendants from the moon gods, and you people down there with very little property, you were descendants from whatever, the rodent totem or whatever kind of thing. So often you'll find in many ancient societies that the rulers will claim a celestial pedigree, that they claim to be specially placed in regard to the divine forces. That was true of Europe